Our guest speaker tonight is not just a best-selling author and a familiar byline in the Washington Post on stories about work-life issues and poverty. She's also one of us, a Northern Virginian from someplace else. Lots of us are. But she's here now raising 2 kids with a spouse who also has a busy career in the news business. Overwhelmed is not just the title of the book that she's going to discuss tonight, but it could also describe the number of holds the library has for it. Those of you who clamored to try and read this book in advance of this meeting may have learned the list is quite long to get your hands on it. So, in honor of Brigid's visit with us tonight, the Friends of the Library have added 5 more copies to the library collection.
Woohoo!
In hopes that we'll speed up that waiting list just a bit. It is my pleasure to introduce author and reporter Brigid Schulte. She will try and explain to us what happened to all that leisure time that we are told exists somewhere, and yet we cannot find it. So, Ms. Schulte, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. Do you want me to stand at the podium, or can I? All right, I'm used to being wandering around in my jeans with a reporter's notebook sitting in the back, so I'm not used to being up here. So you'll have to forgive me. I try not to be too formal. And I'd love this to be interactive, so what I figured I'd do is I'd read a little bit and tell you a little bit about how I got started on this, and then I'd love to open it up and have a really wide-ranging discussion. What I figured I'd do, this book is called Overwhelmed, Work, Love, and Play When No One Has the Time. And since it's really all about the good life, work, love, and play, that came from Erik Erikson, who is a Harvard psychologist, or was. And he said the richest and fullest lives maintain some kind of internal balance between the 3 great arenas of life: work, love, and play. And at the time when I started writing this book, I didn't have any kind of internal balance about anything. And so this book is really a journey, and this is toward the end. The book is divided into 5 sections. One is time confetti, sort of why are things the way they are, and then I go into work, love, and play. And in each of these sections, I wanted to figure out why are things the way they are, why there's this feeling of time pressure and such a widespread feeling of being overwhelmed. And then I also wanted to know, but how can they be better? And I went, as a journalist, I didn't want the 10 ways to take back your time, the 5 ways to organize this, the 7 ways to do that. Believe me, I have bought all of those magazines that promise you to help you to do that. And they're good advice. It's just that it's very difficult, and I wanted to understand why is it difficult and what can you do about it in the face of the difficulty. So being a reporter, being someone who is very evidence-based, you know, my training teaches me to be skeptical, but to keep an open mind. I went out in search of bright spots. That's what Chip and Dan Heath call places where change is already underway, where things are already shifting, where we might be able to learn some lessons. And so that was my whole goal, was to sort of shed the light on places where things are already changing, and to see if we could change the narrative and see if we could change to make the good life more accessible to all of us. So the last section of the book is called Toward Time Serenity. There's a wonderful term in time use research. They call it time serenity or time adequacy. I think time serenity sounds nicer. And that's generally the sense that you have enough time to do all the things that you need to and want to. I'm not there yet, but I'm a whole lot better than I was in the first part of the book, which I call time confetti, because that's what my time felt like. And so this is from the section Toward Time Serenity, this happened here. I live in Alexandria. I live in Delray. I'm a very proud Delravian, and in my years at the Washington Post, I've done a lot of reporting up here in Arlington as well. Love Arlington. Keep Clarendon weird. You know, love that. Okay, so this is chapter 13. It's called Finding Time, and it starts with a quote from Annie Dillard. "The way you live your days is the way you live your life." I sit at a table with 4 other people, pencil in hand, paralyzed. In front of each of us lies a blank calendar for 1 week, starting on Sunday and ending on Saturday. Each day is broken into hourly grids, starting at 6 a.m. and ending at midnight. The task at this day-long time triage workshop sounds simple enough. Design your perfect schedule. What would you do, say, on Tuesday at 10 a.m. or on Friday at 3 p.m. to make your life meaningful? What, when you really come down to the quotidian details, does it look like every day to have time to do good work, to spend quality time with your family and friends, and to refresh your soul? That's what the Greeks called leisure time, that place where you refresh your soul. I stare at the page. And so does everyone else. A real estate agent who feels there's so much chaos between her work and life demands that it seems as if her time is bleeding. A man who just wants to figure out how to relax on the weekends without feeling guilty. His wife who wants the world to stop for a few days so she can get caught up. A young woman living on fast forward who has burned through 2 marriages and snaps photos of beautiful sunsets to post on Facebook as she flies down the road on her way to somewhere else. I just feel this tremendous sense of loss all the time, she said. We'd started the workshop that morning with a very different exercise, filling in a schedule of what we'd done the past week. That was easy. Everyone jam-packed the little hour grids with so much stuff that the cramped handwriting spilled out onto the margins of the page. Terry Monahan, our no-nonsense leader and self-described productivity expert, then asked us what we'd do if our schedules opened up, and we suddenly found we had more time. Read, I said. The others chimed in. Sleep. Organize all the drawers. Learn to sail. Sew. Pray. Travel. Be happy. Where is the time for that on your schedules? Moynihan had asked. There wasn't any. That's when she'd given us these blank calendars and told us to find the time. We stare, stumped for several more uncomfortable minutes. Terry Monahan's approach to time management is simple. You can't manage time. Time never changes. There will always and ever be 168 hours in a week. What you can manage are the activities you choose to do in time. And what busy and overwhelmed people need to realize, she said, is that you will never be able to do everything you think you need, want, or should do. When we die, the email inbox will still be full. The to-do list will still be there. But you won't, she told us. 80% of the email that comes in is crap anyway, and it takes you the equivalent of 19 and a half weeks a year just to sort through. 80% of your to-do list is crap. Look, the stuff of life never ends. That is life. You will never clear your plate so you can finally allow yourself to get to the good stuff. So you have to decide, what do you want to accomplish in this life? What's important to you right now? And realize that what's important now may not be 2 years from now. It's always changing. Moynihan looks at us staring forlornly at our blank, perfect schedules. She sighs. This is not rocket science here, people, she says. Start with time for what's most important. But that's where I got stuck. Everything seemed important. My work, my family, my friends, my community, changing the kitty litter, sorting my daughter's Barbie shoes, keeping the incoming tide of clutter in the house at bay. That, Ellen Ernst Kostic, an organizational psychologist and management professor at Purdue University, would later tell me, means that I'm not only an integrator of work and home duties, but the kind of uber integrator she calls a fusion lover. Unlike separators who keep their work and life separated with bright lines, I tend to do everything all at once, all the time. In her book, CEO of Me, Kostic writes that some people thrive on integration, answering work emails from the sidelines of a child's soccer game, or checking in with the babysitter in the afternoon at the office, juggling 100 different balls with aplomb. But if that integration was making me feel overwhelmed, then I wasn't doing it particularly well. The downside to being a fusion lover, she said, is that people like me tend to get confused over which demand is more pressing in the moment, so we don't have a clear focus on what to do. We can't decide. So we end up doing both work and home activities in an ambivalent, half-hearted way, which produces mediocre outcomes and vague disappointment in both. Youch. So that's a little bit of a downer of a note. Maybe I should end on a higher note, but maybe that'll come out in the questions. So very briefly, I was just going to explain how this whole journey got started. Someone asked me yesterday, it's like, well, didn't you just have this moment where you decided, boy, I'm living this crazy life and it's just unsustainable and it's just got to stop? And I said, no, I never had that moment. I never stopped long enough to think about it. And honestly, when I was living that way, when my kids were a little younger and before I learned everything that I learned in here, I just never stopped. I never stopped to think that it could be any different. I felt as a working mother, I felt so guilty all the time. I felt like if I was really busy, I simply just deserved to be this busy because didn't I make this choice to be a working mother? If I didn't have leisure time, well, wasn't that because I just didn't deserve it? So I never really stopped to think about it. And then I was part of this group at the Washington Post a couple years ago, and this is before the days of digital. We were still very much married to the print paper, which is now probably going away, and I don't know how many of you have subscriptions left anymore. Oh, good. This is my 401k. Well, maybe we'll figure out how to make money online, I'm not sure. But at any rate, at the time, we were looking at our demographic, at our readership numbers, and we were seeing this large gap between male and female readers that they hadn't really seen before in the younger generation. Women between the ages of 18 and, say, 45, 49, there was a big gap between the, women and men in terms of who was reading the paper. And so the powers that be got very nervous. Why? Because at the time when you looked at our demographic numbers, women over 50 were our strongest reader group. They were the most loyal readers. So if you don't have them reading at 20 to 49, well, extrapolate that out 20 years, you don't have readers and you don't have people buying your product. So that was a huge concern, and so the powers that be put together what they called the Women Readers Committee, and I was appointed to this Women Readers Committee. And I walked in to a room, and seated around the table were all women. And it really felt like 1972 all over again. Wow, aren't we beyond this? The women's pages, the women's readers group. And so we all looked around at each other. We were trying to figure out why women aren't reading the paper. And we all just rolled our eyes almost at once. We all had very heavy caregiving responsibilities, caring for children or aging parents. One was raising her niece and nephew as a guardian. We had these very heavy responsibilities and roles outside of work, and we were working in a very demanding workplace and trying to compete with people who had somebody else taking care of all of that at home. Many of our colleagues had at-home spouses who could take care of all of that. So in a sense, we were trying to smush two lives into one. And one of the things that I came to learn in my book is that our demanding workplaces, particularly for salaried or knowledge workers like a media person or a news reporter is, content provider, whatever you want to call it in the internet age. These hours have been expanding really since the 1980s. Knowledge workers have been working longer and longer hours since the 1980s. And at the same time, what we expect of parents, particularly of mothers, has also been, the standards have also been rising at about that same time. It's almost this crazy perfect storm of more and more work hours and higher standards. So we were trying to live up to these impossible standards without really knowing, without even really realizing it. And I think that's hopefully what a lot of my book sort of lays out, is really opens the curtain on what these standards are that we sort of assume people need to meet to be a good worker or to be a good parent or a good mother. So we were living these crazy lives. We rolled our eyes and we said, well, duh, we're too busy. Women are too busy to read the newspaper. And all I had to do was think back to my own life in the morning. The newspaper comes in the morning, and there was my husband standing on the end of the kitchen, as if he was in a bubble, reading the paper, totally unperturbed. And I'm like this whirling dervish, and the kids are coming, and are you up yet? And I'm emptying out the dishwasher and filling out the forms and finding the crumpled up homework and feeding the cat, the stupid cat, and changing the kitty litter and all that stuff. I didn't have time to read the newspaper in the morning. And so, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I hope I wasn't boring. So at any rate, so we just figured women are too busy. That's why they're not reading the paper. But being reporters, again, we wanted evidence, we wanted data. And so somebody said, yeah, like Nielsen, don't they figure out how long we watch TV? Hasn't somebody figured out how busy women are? Aren't there sort of time studies? And I had never heard about it at the time. And I've since come to see that time studies are fascinating, and I'm happy to talk about that in just a little bit. But I said, I don't know. I sort of raised my hand and said, I'll do that. And so I went up to my computer and I Googled busy mother, women, time, and I found these time use researchers. And this one was very close by. His name was John Robinson. He was just up at the University of Maryland. His colleagues call him Father Time because he is one of the very first to bring time use research to the United States. It's a very new kind of social science. It was first pioneered by the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, when they wanted to make sure that their workers were being productive. So it started kind of in the Eastern Bloc countries, which is probably why it didn't come over here during the Cold War. And in the 60s, even though that was still the Cold War, John Robinson started being involved in these international time use studies. And one of the first things they found was, well, are all of these housekeeping devices that were supposed to save women so much time, is it really saving them time? And that was actually a fascinating thing that they discovered, is that all these fancy new dishwashers and vacuum cleaners that everything said, was supposed to save women all this time actually didn't. Women in the United States were still spending as much time on housework as women in Bulgaria, who didn't have any of that stuff. And why, what was fascinating is they discovered the standards of cleanliness just rose. So you just had to get your house even cleaner with more of this stuff. So time use research was actually really fascinating. Now to the point where a lot of countries realize it's the only way that you can really capture what's long been considered the invisible work of housework and child rearing, which, when you think about it, is vital to the future of your economy and the future of your society. You have to raise the next generation well, and so doing all of that housework enables people then to go and contribute productively to the market. And so there are actually some countries now who are including time use data about all of that invisible labor in their GDP and coming up with a more robust definition of what the work of the nation is, and including that caregiving as something that's very vital and important, which I think is fascinating. There's another type of time use that I came to realize that is actually what I was doing. It's called experience sampling method, and what they do is they give their subjects these beepers, and then they'll beep you a couple times during the day, and they'll not only ask you, what are you doing, but they ask you, how do you feel about it? And should you be doing anything else? And in a sense, capturing your perception of time, which, let's face it, is really a lot more real than what the activity is that you're doing. And in doing that experience sampling method, that's where they first discovered what I consider this fantastic term called contaminated time. Because they would ask people, what are you doing? And say, it was a family on a picnic. And so they were going to code it leisure time. Oh, that sounds fantastic. Well, okay, so what are you thinking about? And the dad would be like, oh, I'm so happy I'm here with the kids. I'm feeling so good that I'm not at work. This is awesome. And they're like, oh, great. And then they'd ask the mom, and what are you thinking? And how are you feeling? It's like, oh my God, I got to fix the carpool. I forgot to do that. I got to go grocery shopping. What's for dinner? And did this guy, did he ever call me back about the plumber? And I got to do this for work. And their minds were just going a million miles an hour with all of the stuff that they had to do. Largely because women are still doing about twice the housework and twice the child care. Even though men have tripled the amount of time they're doing their child care and housework, they're still doing about half of what women are doing. And women are still largely the default parent, or kind of logistics central. And they're kind of delegating, but that doesn't take the sort of what they call mental labor off the plate. And so that was really when they first discovered that women's time tends to be very cluttered and fragmented with all of the stuff they've got to do. So it's very difficult to be in the moment. You can be in a moment of leisure and it doesn't feel very leisurely because you've got that kind of, call it like a running toilet going in your mind, the CNN ticker going across your head all the time. So at any rate, I called this John Robinson up and I said, we're doing this study on why women don't read the newspaper and we figure they're too busy. And he interrupted me. He said, wrong. Women aren't too busy. Women have 30 hours of leisure a week. They don't have as much leisure time as men, although that's very common, but they have more leisure time now than they did in the 1960s, even though more of them are working in the marketplace now. And it was one of those moments, it was like, well, whose life are you talking about? And I thought he was joking. I just said, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have 30 hours of leisure. I kind of did a quick little inventory of my previous week, and I think the only thing that I would really consider leisure that I had had the previous week was maybe a yoga class on a Saturday morning at the Y down in Alexandria that I always ran into 10 minutes late. I just ran into my yoga teacher last week, and she said, "You are always late." And I said, "Yeah," because it was at 8:30, and I was horribly guilty that I was leaving my children first thing on Saturday, and I really should be with them, and I wanted them, not to be awake because I didn't want to feel bad. And they always woke up at like 8:25 or 8:28, right as I was creaking out the door, "Mommy, oh!" So I was always late because I felt so guilty. Now I realize I should have just gone, but then I was really guilty. So I felt I had maybe 50 minutes of pure leisure time, and he's saying I have 30 hours. And I said, "I don't know what you're talking about. You're out of your mind." And he said, come and do a time study with me, and I will show you where your leisure time is." So he sort of laid down this gauntlet, and honest to God, I mean, I really like John Robinson. He is a very nice, we actually talk still. He's a very nice man. I just disagree vehemently with him and his point of view. But talk about one phone call changing your life. Because honestly, I walked into the women readers group the next day, and I sort of felt like, again, 1972, can you believe what this man just told me? Somebody totally didn't understand my life. And so the woman who was running the women readers group was also an editor at the Washington Post magazine. And she said, "Go do the time study and write about it for me." So a year and a half later, I finally got around to it. I tell you, there were a couple of things going on. One, I was furious, and I wanted to prove him wrong. Two, I was terrified that he was right, and that I was somehow wasting my life, and I was going to find out about it, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to change it, and that's a terrifying thing. It's like, I know I don't smoke, but I imagine it's the same thing. I should stop smoking. I know it's going to kill me, and it's difficult to do. And I need to lose weight. We all know we should. It's difficult to do. At the time, I was, 30 pounds overweight, and I wasn't exercising, and I knew I needed to, but I only had that 50-minute yoga class, and I had like wicked stress eczema. I was not in good shape. So it was one of those things where I was terrified to confront what the truth might be. And the other thing, honest to God, is at the time I was on the Metro staff, and writing for the magazine was something you were supposed to do in your free time, and I didn't have any free time. And so then we did a big reorganization at the newspaper, and I became part of the enterprise team, where writing for the newspaper became part of your job. And so my new editor said, "Hey, that looks like an interesting story. Why don't you do that?" And I said, "During the day?" He's like, "Yeah." I said, "On post time?" He's like, "Yeah." So 6 weeks later, I had the story done. So that just shows you, I didn't have any free time, but once it became my job, I actually did the story. And when I wrote the story, I told him, I was really terrified. I'd never really written a lot of first-person kind of journalism. And it's sort of, in journalism, it's sort of seen as self-indulgent. And I didn't really want to, I was very conflicted about doing that. And I told him, I said, "Listen, I will be honest to the point of not getting fired." Because I was really afraid that I was going to come out looking like this kind of crazy, neurotic, disorganized person, and that everybody else had it wired, and there was something really wrong with me. Because when I talked to John Robinson, he clearly, that was his view, that there was something wrong with me. And so when the story came out, it was in January of 2010. I'll never forget. We went away for the weekend. It's like I spent the whole weekend in a sort of a fetal crouch. I don't want to know. I don't want to know. And I tell you, the week before this book came out, I did the same thing. What have I done? Oh my God. I can't believe it. Someone's like, "Oh, you were so honest." I'm like, "I know, warts and all, I know." So what surprised me is when the story came out, if you read the online comments, because unfortunately we still allow anonymous online comments, so I don't know who all these nasty people are that always comment on the Washington Post website. This is for all the developers. If you're watching this, make sure that we have named comments in the future. It's just, it's just not a level of discourse that I think is very valuable. But if you read those who are just online comments, then you will see they all think that I'm crazy, neurotic, disorganized, and I'm just a terrible person, and it's all me. But then what started happening is I started getting personal emails from people, and I got phone calls. And I got so many emails that were so long and so filled with emotion. And almost all of them, there were a couple that said, "You're neurotic, you're crazy, you're disorganized, it's all you." But most of them said something on the lines of, "You climbed into my head and you wrote about my life." And that really shocked me, because there were young people and there were old people. And there were people with kids, there were people without kids. There were millennials who were terrified of starting a family because they didn't want what I had. There were people who had families who said, I don't know how to get out of this. I'm in there with you and I don't want to be here. There were retired people who said, you know, we don't have work now, and we're kind of like spinning our wheels. We kind of don't know how to define ourselves, and then we just keep ourselves busy and puttering around all the time. I don't know that we have leisure time. I don't know that we really fully live on our moments and enjoy our lives. And there was just this kind of universal sadness or pain or rage out there. And this one woman came to me and she just said, you know, I don't have the skills that you do. I'm not a reporter, but you can go out and try to figure this out. And if you do that, I will follow you wherever you go. And to be perfectly honest, it was that stack of emails and that woman telling me that finally gave me the impetus to say, all right, I'll try to figure this out. And I had a couple agents contacting me, because one of the things I wrote about in the magazine article was how inadequate I felt at everything, from taking care of our cat to taking care of our kids to the house. Yeah, folding the laundry, it's still not folded if you go to my house. I just don't care now, whereas then I did. You know, but one of the things that I said is, I see all of my colleagues and they're winning these great prizes and they're writing books, and I just felt very inadequate even at the work that I was doing, despite all of the hours that I was spending at it. And so these agents started calling me and they said, you know, you said you wanted to write a book, you know, do you want to write about this? And to be perfectly honest, I really didn't. At first I was like, what more can I say, you know? And then I didn't really know. I didn't want to write a mommy book. I was very resistant to the idea of writing a book for about a year. And I have a running partner, and one of our favorite routes is over here on Wilson, and we run across the Key Bridge and then down along in front of Kennedy Center and then over Memorial and then back up. One of the Pacers early morning runs, I love them. So we would go on these long runs, and I would just, I don't want to write a mommy book. I don't want to write a stupid book. You know, I don't want it to be complaining. I just don't know that I want to do this. I don't know if I want to write about leisure time, because leisure seems so dumb, and everybody else is writing about war and politics and stuff that's important, you know. And I struggled with this for a long time, and I would try to kind of put together a book proposal, and finally a friend of mine, it was, you know, so the article came out in January. By August, when I still hadn't written a book proposal, a friend of mine said, you are going to my sister's house in Matthews, Virginia. You are not coming home until the proposal is done. I will take care of your kids. And I had no idea where Matthews, Virginia was. I said, okay. And I did, and the whole way down I was listening to like Wayne Dyer, No Excuses. Because I was so afraid I would come back without having written this book proposal. And so I did. I spent the weekend down there. I wrote this book proposal. I came back. And what I love so much is that Sarah Crichton at Farrar, Straus & Giroux, when I went with my agent, who I absolutely love, Gail Ross is amazing, we went to New York to talk to different publishers, and several of them wanted the mommy book. Oh, wouldn't this be funny? It'll be like the Nanny Diaries. And I just thought, I don't want to do that. We all know how hard it is to juggle. I don't want another kind of like, I don't know how she does it, which is a funny book, but I finished it. I don't know if you guys read it. I threw it across the room. It's like, really? That's the answer? I'm supposed to quit my job and move to the country and slash in puddles with my kids? It's like, what if you like your job? What if you don't know, you know, what if you don't know what to do in the country? Or what if your husband really likes their job and he doesn't want to move to the country? You know, is that really the only answer, to drop out? And so, so I really, when I talked to Sarah, she's like, I get what you're trying to do. And I would talk long and, you know, have these long conversations with Gail and my agent. And she's like, oh, I get it. You want to write a game changer. I'm like, yes, that's what I want to do. I just had all this sort of incoherent rage. Like, why is it like this? And why is it like this particularly for women? And why do I not get what's going on with men? And there's a whole chapter in there, I call it the Stalled Gender Revolution chapter, where it really looks at gender roles. And my first draft, I have to tell you, I call it my rage draft, because I'm so angry that somehow that my husband and I had started out saying we were going to be equal partners. And man, I don't know if you've read the book, but the chapter starts out with this particularly horrendous Thanksgiving just 2 years ago. So we'd been married about 20 years at the time. We were going to have 18 people over. I know, Martha Stewart living in my head. Why was I doing that? the house was just, it looked like a bomb had gone off. Their turkey's still raw. We ran the turkey trot in the morning, and then we were going to have, cook all afternoon. It's 2 o'clock. Half the stuff isn't done. My husband comes over. I think he's going to put the turkey in. He opens the fridge, and he pulls out a 6-pack of beer. And he says, I'm going to go over to Peter's house and smoke a turkey. I'm like, you're going to what? And he's like, and he just kind of shrugged, and he walked out the door. And honestly, I had a knife in my hand. And if I just had like circus training, just kind of get right close to his ear. I've told that story before, and Tom is a reporter at NPR. He covers the military, and he said that he's gotten an awful lot of calls about the turkey story. And this one was from this retired Marine colonel, this woman. She said, if you were my husband, you wouldn't have made it out the door. She said, but then again, I'm a trained killer. So we really had to take a look, because that was a lot of what was polluting my time. As I was doing all of we kind of at one point, I got so overloaded. I started writing down who did what, and take the kids to the doctor, me, dentist, me. He didn't even know where they were. Stay home when they're sick, me. Pay the bills, me. Taxes, me. And I kept thinking, what does he do? Occasionally takes out the garbage, So it was it had become very unequal, and I really had to try to figure out why. And so after I wrote that first draft, I had a very wise friend say, you really need to understand what's going on from Tom's perspective. And so I did the only thing I know how to do as a reporter. I have these wonderful reporter notebooks, and I stick them in my back pocket. And we just went on long walks all throughout Delray. We'd go like once a week, and I just took out my notebook and I just would interview him. And it helped, because I think when we tried to talk before, we would always get stuck. I'd be so angry and resentful, and he'd be so defensive, and we kind of wouldn't get anywhere. So a lot of people figured this out, and God bless you that you do. We hadn't. And so it started really right when our son was born, our first child. And I said, why did you never take parental leave? I was angry at you for 20 years that you didn't take parental leave. And he just said, we had it. It was a policy on the books. And I knew that, so that's why I didn't understand why I didn't take it. We had it as a policy on the books, but everybody knew that if you were a man, you just didn't take it. There was only one man who ever did, and he was sort of a star. He said, I was very worried about my position. You were sort of seen as not a good worker if you actually took it. It was the kind of place where people would leave their lights on and like leave a suit coat at the back of their chair and their computers on and sneak out at 8 o'clock at night, because FaceTime was what they really valued, being in the office these long hours, which is kind of crazy. He was working at a newspaper at the time, but that is very much that kind of macho culture. And you see that still, and it's that long hours that we reward. And there have been studies that have since come out that show the amount that we reward people who put in those long hours has increased something like 30% in recent years. And who does that favor? That tends to favor men who can do that. The other thing that I discovered is that there was a group of consultants, and they asked people around the globe, CEOs and top managers, who do you consider the best workers? And 3/4 of them said, we think the best workers are those who have no caregiving responsibilities. Well, who is that? Well, frankly, that's really nobody anymore, but that's particularly women. And so what I came to see is how our workplaces really freeze men at work, and they keep women, kind of these ideal mothers, kind of freeze women at home. And we're doing this sort of unconsciously. I don't think that there's any like nefarious bad guys out there. It's just when you think about it, the way that the world has changed, we've changed so much more rapidly in terms of the way we live our lives than the way that our laws or our workplace structures or even our attitudes about gender has changed. And so that's really where the overwhelm starts, this kind of disconnect between the way we're living and the way we think we should, or the way our structures are set up. For instance, our workplace laws, the Fair Labor Standards Act, that was set up in 1938. That protects the 40-hour work week, which frankly, I don't know who works that anymore. Because if you're a knowledge worker, you're expected to be there a long time, whether you get paid for it or not. And if you are a low-wage worker, it's very difficult for you to find enough hours in the day to make ends meet. So you're cobbling together several different jobs. So you've kind of got work hours doing two different things, which is why the average US work hours mean nothing. Nobody works that. You're either working at either end of the extreme, and you're feeling stressed on either end. So to get back to gender roles, I will just say that after these long walks and really kind of trying to understand how we both had fallen into traditional gender roles, we both bought into the notion that I should do everything just because I was the mom. I tell you, one of the most revelatory days that I had in reporting, I spent with Sarah Blaffer-Hurdy on her walnut farm in California. And she's one of the foremost experts, the world's most foremost experts in motherhood. And she helped me see so much about, really what the science is, because at first I was saying, is it just natural that I should, be home with the kids? Am I just naturally wired to be the primary caregiver? And what's fascinating is men, too, are wired for nurture. We just never knew that because we didn't ever look. Men also produce estrogen when they become fathers. Their testosterone level drops. They produce prolactin, the same hormone that produces breastfeeding. They have neurological changes. There was a recent study done in Israel of gay dads, and they found that their brains light up in the caregiving arenas the same way that mothers do, and that their cognitive lights up like fathers do. So they're sort of like the perfect parent, because they've kind of got the emotional and the caregiving and the cognitive side lighting up. And what's fascinating, I was talking to Dr. Kyle Pruitt just today. I wrote a piece for the Washington Post magazine, or not, Washington Post online, because now we're doing everything online. And I think it'll be in the paper tomorrow. They call it reverse publishing. It may not, I don't know. Look for it online. It's a really interesting story about this growing trend of at-home dads. It's still a fairly small number, but it's still doubled since 1989. And the most fascinating thing is there's been a fourfold increase in the number of dads who say they're home because they want to be. That's their choice. And what's really interesting, so I was talking to Dr. Kyle Pruitt, who's at Yale, who's been studying fathers, one of the handful of people studying fathers, who just said, we didn't even know about these hormonal changes in men until we discovered it by accident looking at thyroid changes. So we didn't even know, we didn't even look at how dads are. We just expected them to be these distant provider, breadwinner fathers. And the interesting thing is to discover that's really a very recent phenomenon. That's an artifact of the Industrial Revolution, which again is a fairly recent phenomenon. That throughout all of human history, when you look at when we lived on farms and they were much more agricultural, dads were integral. Families worked together. Mothers worked. They just worked on the family farm. So it really helped me see in a larger sense how men and women care, and how I don't have to do everything. I'm not, it's not because of my wiring. So I will say that in closing, before I turn it over to you guys for questions, and I'm happy to answer any questions you've got or have a discussion. I will just close by saying we have learned, we're still works in progress, all of us. But one of the things that we've really worked at is trying to rebalance that division of labor in our own house, really questioning our own assumptions about who does what and who should do what. So for instance, the most recent Thanksgiving, so the bad Thanksgiving, that was 2011. 2012, I took a break. I'm like, I'm not doing it this year. And we went to a friend's house. And so last year we tried it again. And this was sort of the maiden voyage of our new division of labor. And so what we did is we came together as a family, and we sat around our kitchen table. And really what was important was not the Martha Stewart in my head and what I thought I should do as the perfect housewife, I guess. And we thought what's really important is how we feel today. What does this moment need to feel like for us? And so we talked about what we all wanted by the end of the day, how we wanted to feel, what were the fun things that were important to us. And then we came up with a list of all the work that it would take to make that happen. And then we divided that work fairly. So my daughter, she was 12 at the time, she made mashed potatoes. My son, he was in charge of bread. Tom did the turkey and the stuffing. And when he came home with stovetop, I bit my lips, or bit my tongue, because I don't even like stuffing. And, I had to squish Martha out of my brain. And I did the vegetables and I did the pie, and, and we had a really lovely day. And at the end of it, we all did the dishes together and we all went to bed at the same time. And so there is the fact that we could go from so awful to so much better really gives me hope. And the bright spots give me a lot of hope. I found innovative workplaces that are really changing and helping both men and women become authentic people. And authentic, that means understanding that they need and want time for work, love, and play. You know, I found places like the Third Path Institute that helped us try to figure out, well, what makes sense for our family outside of what these external pressures are. And then I also found, I went to Denmark, where a time use study showed that both men and women there have among the most leisure time of any parents anywhere, or any people anywhere, that women have almost as much leisure time as men, and that mothers there have the most pure leisure time of any mother in any country they studied. Pure leisure time is what we would call me time here, and I will tell you that American mothers have zero, because they spend almost all of their leisure time with their children, I think because we feel like we need to and we have to, and we're soaked with guilt. And I can tell you why, but I'd like to open it up to questions, and thank you so much for coming and sharing your time with me.
I just can't imagine what John Robinson meant when he said women have 36 hours of leisure. I mean, how can you lump all women together? I certainly have a lot more leisure now than when my children were small or even living at home. So, I mean, that just seems insane to me to say something like that.
Right, I think that's a really good point. And the other reason, that's why I brought that up about the average U.S. work hours. I think that's one of the failings of time use research, is when we take averages. Sometimes it's the best that we can do, but it's a very crude science, because those average work hours, nobody works those. You're either working extremely long hours, or you're working those, you know, cobbling together several part-time hours. So that average doesn't really exist. And the whole thing with leisure, what's interesting to me is when I started looking more and more into time use research, and believe me, I have read a lot of time studies by now. You know, time squared, what is that? You know, so I skip sections that I don't understand. Get to the conclusion, okay, what's important about this? But you know, when time use research was fairly new in the 60s and 70s, and it was done primarily by men, they used to categorize childcare as leisure time. Now, doesn't that tell you something? Because the men who were deciding what time should be or how it should be categorized, they were at work, and they thought being at home with the kids and playing sounded like a lot of fun. So I think that tells you something right there about the separation, you know, of those separate spheres. So it's changed over time. So the averages are one thing that's difficult. The other thing that's difficult about the way that, you know, the sort of the John Robinson school, when he looked through my time diary, he found 27 hours of what he called leisure. And I looked at it, and it was like little bits and scraps of garbage. I called it time confetti. It didn't really add up to much of anything. It was 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there, things like laying in bed, listening to the radio, trying to get out of bed. And I was like, are you kidding? I was exhausted. The reason I love the cover so much is that when he was analyzing my time diary, he took out a yellow highlighter, and he was like going through it like, read, yep, leisure, read, leisure. I'm like, what? No. That can't be leisure. That's awful. The Greeks said leisure, you know, we work to have leisure upon which happiness is built. You know, that was supposed to be enjoying the fruits of our labor. When I think about leisure, I was thinking long stretches of sort of timeless, laying in a hammock, or a sick day when I didn't have to take care of anything and I didn't have to feel guilty about that laundry that never gets folded. So honestly, what you've got is a real disconnect. Leisure scholars will say that true leisure is in the eye of the beholder, that it really depends on how you feel. That perception of time is really what makes it leisure, and you need two things for that. You need a sense of choice and a sense of control over that time. So, so that's one thing that the traditional way of gathering time doesn't take that into consideration. You know, the other thing that I'd sort of discovered is that they have very definitive categories that they put time activities into: work, commuting, personal care, sleep, and then everything that doesn't sort of fit into those categories they shove into leisure time. So I think that there is a real problem with the way we gather data. It's sort of a very blunt, crude instrument, which is why the experience sampling method, it's harder to do, it's more time intensive, which is why the American Time Use Survey, it's basically, there's like 4 or 5 people over in the Bureau of Labor Statistics, And they call people up who've been part of the current population survey. I think that's a part of one of the census things. And they call them up and they'll just be on the phone with them and say, okay, what did you do last night at midnight? Okay, and then what did you do at 12:15? Okay, and then what did you do at 12:30? And kind of go through your day in 15-minute increments, and they'll do it by recall. So it's a very imperfect way of trying to get at that kind of nebulous thing of how we spend our time. So it's imperfect, but anyway, it's a good point.
I first read about the book, I was looking at the New Yorker a month ago, and they had excerpt, and that was the kind of thing where the New Yorker makes me feel inadequate, like I'm not, because it comes every week, and you're trying, but anyway, I saw this and I thought, wow, this is great, and I'd recognized you from the Post, but how do you handle, as I have 3 children and they're fairly young, how do you handle that expectation of even just being able to sit and read the New Yorker for 2 minutes and not, that's leisure time to me, but I guess the guilt of that, I mean, I know it's a kind of wide-ranging question, but I would just be interested in your take.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm so glad you asked that, because this is the other thing. I had no idea that there was such a thing out there as feminist leisure research. I mean, who knew, right? I mean, that was what was so fun. I found all these like weird, obscure things going on out there. And it's also a shrinking field. And what's really interesting is that we don't really have many leisure studies departments anymore because we're all so embarrassed in this country about leisure time. It's not productive. And so the few that are left have renamed themselves as sort of like Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism. Or, they're not leisure studies. At Canada and Waterloo, they probably have the most robust, named leisure studies department anymore. But I think that it's very indicative that, number one, in America, we are very, the Protestant work ethic is very powerful here. Work is important. Work is how we show our identity. It's become even increasingly more so in recent decades. But leisure is something that we really devalue. I remember I was in the chapter 2, I said in Paris, which was amazing to go there, at a time use research conference. And so I was sort of feeling the same thing. Well, I should be here working. I'm away from my kids for the first time ever. I can't believe I'm in Paris. I can't afford this. My visa's almost maxed out. What am I doing here? And so but I was on this search for these 30 hours of leisure, right? And I was trying to understand time use and leisure. And so I thought, and John Robinson he was taking me on leisure lessons. And so you'll see that I actually had to cut a few of them out. But He's like, if you can't come to Paris and really enjoy yourself, there's something really wrong with you. So he took me on these bizarre leisure lessons. And one was he took me shopping, and I'm like, I hate shopping, And we were by the train station, and he's like, yeah, why don't you buy this? I'm like, I hate shopping. I have a headache. Why am I here? Oh, I thought you liked shopping. So I mean, that was sort of nuts. And so then I thought, okay, well, I really should have leisure. So I was training for my first half marathon. And I went for a 10-mile run, like at 5 in the morning. And I felt so good about that. And one of the Australian researchers there, who was a huge leisure researcher, she's like, so, she came back from some shopping trip, and she'd had coffee with a friend, and she was all relaxed. She said, so did you have leisure? I'm like, yes, I went for a 10-mile run this morning. And I was so proud of myself. And she just looked at me, and she turned up her nose. She goes, purposive leisure. How American. So even in our leisure time, it has to have some kind of purpose or be productive. So there is that kind of large-scale feeling in the United States, but particularly for women. This is what I found really fascinating, and it helped me a lot because I always had this sort of if-then mentality, which kind of showed up in that Finding Time chapter. I would have this huge long to-do list and this feeling like if I did this and this and this and this and this, and I got to the end of this to-do list, which frankly was always impossible, then I could read, or then I would have earned this sense of leisure time. I felt like I had to earn it, that I didn't deserve it. Oh, I need to fold the clothes before I can do this. And so what was interesting, and probably another one of those aha revelatory things, the feminist leisure research, they did this study of women around the globe. And they found that regardless of their age, their country, their socioeconomic status, that women around the globe felt that they did not deserve leisure time. They had to earn it. And that's not something that men felt. And the only way that women felt that they could earn that leisure time was to get to that end of that long to-do list. Every woman, everywhere had this if-then mentality. And it's funny because when I would report, when I was out reporting on the book, I would hear so many men say, oh, I sit down to relax, and man, my wife is on my case, and she's like, where's the list, and why aren't you doing this? And, you know, and it was like a source of tension for the family. Like the guy at the time, the section that I read when I was just opening, I'm sure he felt guilty sitting around and enjoying leisure time on the weekend because his wife was bustling around and really mad at him for sitting down. And a lot of that is because when you look at the history of leisure, I think this is a really important thing. Women have never had a history or culture of leisure. That when you look at the history of leisure time, and it's all in chapter 2, it really started with high status men. And the classic of leisure studies is called The Theory of the Leisure Class by Thorstein Veblen. He wrote that in 1899. And when I finally got around to reading it, man, he dispenses with women on page 2. You know, he talks about how high status men, to show their status, they would get further and further away from the drudge work. And so they were priests and warriors and leaders, you know, and when they would sit around and somebody else was sweeping the floor or cleaning up or changing the diapers. And so he said the drudge work of society has always been done by the inferior class, which has included the slaves and also all the women. So I think that that's also a very helpful thing to know, is that if you feel guilty, it's because for millennia, women haven't felt like they have deserved that kind of time. And I think that's why this is a very interesting moment, you know, time for all people to reclaim the sense of leisure. You know, why is leisure important? Why is it not stupid? Well, I will tell you that it's in leisure when you have your nose off the grindstone, when you are in those kind of timeless moments. That's really when civilization has been created. You know, the wheel, that came from hanging around the campfire. Art, philosophy, literature, that all came from time out of time. Women have never had access to that kind of time, which is one reason why women have been, you know, there aren't sort of like, you know, the great books are all written by men because the women were doing the invisible work. So now that we are at this time where we are shifting gender roles, where men can lean out, if you will, and be more involved at home, like the at-home dads I was writing about today, where women have more opportunity in the public sphere, you know, it's time for everyone to reclaim this sense of refreshing your soul, that men and women get to do that. You know, and what a challenge now for everybody is technology, kind of always dividing everybody's time and always flipping things on, and you know, that's now fragmenting everybody's time. That, you know, but particularly that sense of guilt is very real for women. But it makes it better for you, and it makes it better for your partnership. And so not only has leisure been created, but I just read a piece called "The Case for Daydreaming." And I think that this is going to be crazy, but I think it helps Americans with our very productive and work-focused point of view, that when we are idle, our brains are actually most active. And, you know, in a way, it gives us permission to be idle and daydream and goof off in a way that we probably wouldn't give ourselves permission before. And why that's important is that when we're idle, neuroscience is finding that this thing called the default mode network lights up. And what's fascinating about that is that the default mode network connects, it works like airport hubs, and it connects different parts of your brain that don't typically talk to each other. So when you're staring out the window, the default network lights up, and maybe a stray thought, a memory, something you saw, a little snippet of a song, whatever, it'll all come together and connect in a completely new way, and that's when a new idea kind of comes. Neuroscience is also finding that the aha moment comes, your brain is wired to get it in the shower. So that really, if, you know, now that we're in this knowledge economy, to be creative, to be innovative, to really move forward, you need this oscillation between concentrated work and deep study and idleness. You know, when you think about Sir Isaac Newton, you know, who's deeply involved in, you know, the physical sciences, and what happens? One evening he's in his garden and he's drinking tea and he's hanging out and he's just relaxed, and this apple falls. Like, gravity. You know, J.K. Rowling was somebody who was on she was a researcher for Amnesty International, and she was on a train between Manchester and London. The train got stuck for 4 hours, And everybody, they didn't have cell phones at the time. Everybody's like doing their work and taking out their newspapers. She stared out the window. And for all intents and purposes, she looked like some space cadet. And when she was done, the entire plot of the Harry Potter series, she said, has just fell into her head. So there is a real reason to be idle and to take leisure time. And it makes you better for who you are, makes it better for your kids, makes it better for your relationships, that it is important to do. Last story I'll tell you, I mentioned that I went to Denmark because I wanted to understand, well, how is it that women can have all this leisure time? How is it that mothers can have this pure leisure time? And I spent time with this one family, and they were doing they switched their long days and short days. And so it was the mom's short day, so she would do the childcare pickup, and it was the dad's long day at work. So the short day meant that you pick your kids up from childcare at 3:30. Everybody does. The bad parents pick their kids up at 4:30 in Denmark. Do you know how many people would love to pick up their kids at 4:30? So she had picked the kids up. He's having the long day. He races home from the office. Now, he works for Parliament. He works for the Speaker of Parliament. So just contrast that with people here on the Hill who work until, midnight, 2 in the morning. And he's racing home from work on his bike in the rain, flies in the door, and says, "Oh, thank God I'm here on time." It's 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And I said, "On time for what?" And the wife comes bounding out of the bathroom in her workout gear, and she just goes, "Time for me to go to my favorite exercise class." And out the door she goes. And then he comes into the kitchen, and he starts making pizza, with like homemade pizza, and it was a sauce that he'd made that morning, because every man in Denmark takes home ec at 14, and they all learn how to cook. And it was really fascinating, and I found that I was spending most of my time with men in Denmark to try to understand why women had more free time. And it quickly became apparent that you needed all three of those elements. For work, they have very short, flexible work hours. The European Union has the European Work Time Directive that you cannot work more than 35 or 37 hours a week. And they don't. And what's fascinating is their culture there rewards efficient, intense work that gets done in that time period. And what they were telling, what anybody that I talked to told me is like, if you work long hours, you're not rewarded, you're just seen as inefficient. And I talked to this one American over there, actually I talked to several, but there's one I profile in the book, and she kept getting dinged on her performance evaluations. And finally she went to her boss and she just said, I'm the first one here. I'm the last one to leave. My car is the only one in the garage. And by the time I leave, everything is closed in this stupid country, and all I can go to is the gas station to buy like packets of stuff to eat for dinner. I'm working my tail off for you, and why am I not getting these better performance evaluations? And they looked at her and they said, because work-life balance is the third most important thing that we evaluate you on, and you don't have any. So go home and have a life, and then you'll do better work. You're burning yourself out, and we don't want that. We're investing in you in the long haul. So they figured work out. They figured out you can work very efficiently in short hours. And I will say very briefly that in the United States we work these long hours. The only two countries that work longer hours than we do are South Korea and in Japan. And in Japan, they have a word for death from overwork called karoshi. They have another word for what they call cloaked overtime, when you're at the office and you're not going to get paid, but you know you can't leave because your boss expects you to be there. They call it furoshiki. And believe me, I get paid by the hour at the Post. Really? Certainly much better now, but lots and lots of years where lots of us on hourly schedules were hours and hours and hours there at the office. And in South Korea, they have these new prisons that they've formed where people can just go and check themselves in and meditate. You get a uniform with a number just to get away from work. So we're not quite that bad. But the interesting thing is then I used to think, well, we have to work this hard. We're number one, we're America, right? Well, this is the fascinating thing when you look at these international studies of GDP per hours worked to get a measure of hourly productivity. Well, guess what? Guess who's number one? Norway. And guess who's number two? Ireland, Luxembourg. And then there's a whole middle range, the United States and France and Denmark. And all these countries that have 30 days of paid vacation, paid parental leave, generous child care subsidies, lots and lots of holidays and short work hours by law. In France, I'm sure you all know that they just passed a law that for a certain number of workers, I think about 200,000 workers, they are not allowed to answer texts or emails related to work after hours. Now, I actually found companies that are already doing that. There's this one place that I visited called Menlo Innovations in Ann Arbor, and they're already doing it not by law, but basically because they want you to go out. They know that the brain constantly seeks novelty. And so if you go out and you go kayaking, or you are home with your kids, or you have these different experiences, you have this authentic full life, you're going to come back in the next day, you're going to be refreshed, ready to go, you work these short, intense hours, and then you are gone. So there was one woman I talked to there who came from, the high-tech industry where 70-hour work weeks is the norm. And so she started diving in. And many of these people were punished in previous jobs for not working more than 70 hours. They would get the bonus. Oh, you're not putting in enough time. And this one woman never saw her son, and she was just filled with guilt. And so it was wonderful to spend time with her working this these short, intense hours, and then going home and watching her daughter learn how to ride a bike. That was, it was fabulous to see. This one woman, she was a single woman, and she dove in and she was working 70 plus hours a week. She said the second week she was on the job, the 3 owners came to her and they said, if you cannot figure out how to do your job in 40 hours, we will fire you. And she said, I had to go home, and after all these years, I had to figure out how to have a life again. So Denmark, why do they have this leisure time? They've figured out work. Gender equality is so important to them that they actually have a minister of gender equality in the cabinet on the same level as the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. I spoke to this one class there, and they said, oh, gender equity, gender equity, gender equity. That's all we ever talk about. Is it like that in the United States? And this is during the last election, and if you remember, we were talking about birth control again. It's like, no, it's not like that in the United States. And be glad that you're talking about it. We need to talk about it more here, and in a real, honest way. And the third thing why women and men have so much leisure time in Denmark is because they value it as a society. For instance, every fall, they have these catalog classes, and every fall, all of these catalogs come into your house. And you can take any class you want on anything under the sun. And they're subsidized by unions and by the government. They're very cheap. Anybody can take them. And it's Italian, it's cooking, you can get your hunting license, speaking, there's just a bajillion things that you can learn, and everybody does it. It's just expected. And I had a friend translate for me on the top of one of the catalogs, it said, for the wisdom and enjoyment of humanity. So there's something there, there's a quality of life that they recognize as important. They have this word they call hygge. It's very difficult to translate, but it's sort of like understanding the beauty of the ordinary moment. The Greeks had 2 kinds of time. One was chronos time, the time of the clock, and rush, and the clocks that tick, and it's sort of the time that we all live in. And this other type of time was called kairos time, which reminds me very much of hygge. And it's that sense of being fully present in the moment. And, and in that moment can become that sort of timeless sense of flow, that leisure time that you do indeed deserve. That was a really long answer.
Thank you. I have a comment and a question. The comment is related to people's guilt, and having grown up in this area, I had 2 parents who would leave for weeks and months at a time for their job. And this was in the 80s before email, so they were only supposed to work 40, 45 hours at most, when they were in a different country without email. So I didn't see them for weeks, and I turned out perfectly fine. So I recommend that if you're away from your kids for leisure time, that you enjoy it, and like my parents sometimes did. So my question is, how much did you run into people who had succeeded in this kind of, in Denmark, obviously, but in the United States, did you run into people who had, simplified their life in some way that they had managed to figure some of this out? Thank you.
Yes. like I said, and that's why I have the bright spots in there. I found companies where people were able to have those authentic lives. There are groups of people who are really working to have kind of a fairer division of labor and share care and work and house in a much fairer way, so that they do have time for the things that they enjoy. I found this group. They call themselves the Womobijoes, working mothers with big jobs. And what was really interesting is they didn't feel overwhelmed. And sort of like Denmark, they all had either very flexible jobs. They really controlled their hours. They also were in relationships where there was a lot more fairness in terms of sharing, so they weren't doing it all. And they all sort of created those boundaries. They didn't have that sense of like, I need to earn it. They felt like, I deserve this now. And sort of making the most of whatever the moments are. So yeah, there are pockets of people who, very few, but I would run into them. It's like, no, I don't feel overwhelmed. It's like, tell me your secret, And so I was looking for them. I found this wonderful group of women in New York. They call themselves Mice at Play, and what they're trying to do is foment a play revolution to try to help women bring more leisure time into their lives. Now, the sad thing is, I just went onto their website, and they have these play dates. And they were trying to get you sort of out of your kind of out of your comfort zone and really get into flow, into play. And so I did. I went the play chapter. I went on a play date with them, and we swang from the trapeze, which was sort of terrifying. But it really did get me out of my comfort zone. It was a really exhilarating experience. And what they were saying is that the most popular play dates were the ones that were like a detox cleanse, or had that kind of productive sense to them, and that women, because they didn't feel like they deserved it, it sounds like they're not doing play dates anymore because they just can't get enough women to do it. So found something hopeful, but it is kind of sad too. That guilt is very powerful. So I hope people will stop feeling so guilty. Read my book, listen to it, or just listen to my words. Stop the guilt.
First, a huge thanks for your candor and your great sense of humor. It's been a lot of fun to listen to you. So I was wondering if you have advice on how you can drop your standards, just probably a very terrible way of putting it, but you said, the laundry, you just don't care, if it's folded or not, but I have a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and I just can't, I'm not at that point yet. So how do you change when you're not naturally like that?
Yeah, well, and you're not. You can't be, because we're all products of the culture that we're all products of our environment. Those are very powerful forces. And the other thing is, humans are very much wired to conform. So we're wired to conform. We're social creatures. We want to fit in. And right now, our society is telling us, if you work, you've got to work like a maniac. And if you're at home, you got to be Martha Stewart and Supermother. Oh, and by the way, you better look like Jennifer Aniston. And I don't even go there in the book. So you've kind of got these really unrealistic ideals that you're supposed to live up to. So it's very hard to push back against all of that. So, so what do you do? Because one of the things that I talk about is change, the structural change, and I talk about how we need conversations about, what are the policies and laws that we really need that would help support people having these authentic lives. Our Fair Labor Standards Act is 1938. Our only family policy is the Family Medical Leave Act, which took 10 years to pass, doesn't cover 40% of the workforce, and is unpaid, and is really sucky, frankly. And you compare that to what other countries have. Why is it that we don't have policies that support, whether you've got families or not, that support people having lives? Why do we let our corporations, our Fair Labor Standards Act, it doesn't protect knowledge workers from overtime. By law, you can work knowledge workers to death. It's perfectly legal. So, why are we not having these larger conversations, but at the same time understanding social change on that level may take a generation or two. Okay, I just turned 52. I'm not going to be around for a generation or two. What can I do right here, right now? And so there are some things that you can do. I think it's important to think about change on both of those levels, the larger structural change and also that personal mastery. So that's what the Finding Time chapter is about. Okay, what's the personal mastery? And I'm going to sound awful. It's like I told you I hate the 10 ways to take back your time. I have 10. So as long as you understand, you got to understand this bigger picture and why it's difficult. So the first thing I say is pause. Find that time to pause, to reflect. Pause, but not to just watch TV. We watch TV, we watch a lot of TV because we're so exhausted. We don't have the energy to do anything else. So whether it's like taking a walk or taking a breath, something, pause to disrupt that cycle of busyness and really kind of get in touch with where you are and what's important to you. One of the things that I found really interesting, I have a section where I went to the Yale Stress Center to figure out, well, what is all this stress doing to our brains? We know that stress is bad for our bodies, and they're finding that stress is shrinking our brains. So that's a terrifying chapter in chapter 3. Read to the epilogue, because what's very hopeful is that Harvard is doing the opposite. And what they did is they took 2 groups of people, and one they had to go about their regular stressful lives. The other one they had go through an 8-week-long mindfulness-based stress reduction program. And what they did is they did brain scans, fMRIs of these 2 groups at the beginning of the 8 weeks and at the end. And what they found is the group that had gone through that mindfulness training for as little as 27 minutes a day of meditating, doing yoga, just being where you are, just being mindful, their brains expanded. So I think that's very powerful. So we need permission. So there you go. Your brains will expand. You get permission, 27 minutes a day. You get that. It will make you better. You have permission. So, okay, don't even think about it as 27 minutes. I know that seems, I don't do it for 27 minutes. I found an app on my iPhone for 10 minutes, so sometimes I try that. But Tara Brock, I went to one of her mindfulness retreats, and she just said to find that time to pause. It was always important to her to be mindful or to make time to be mindful. But when she had, when her son was little, she's like, I gave myself a back door, which was it didn't matter how long it was. That as long as I had the intention that I was going to be mindful, it could be I hung up the phone and I took a breath, and that was enough. And so sometimes when I talk about pausing, however you can do it for however long that is. So that's the first thing, is to kind of just step outside your life a little bit to see what those pressures are. Wow, why am I baking cupcakes at 2 in the morning? Do I really want to do that? Is that important to me? Or am I doing it because I'm worried that all the other moms think I'm a bad mom because I'm a working mom? Hello, that was me. I just never stopped to think about that. And it never stopped to occur to me. It never occurred to me to think, wow, I'm going to be a real witch the next day because I'm so tired. And so the very kid that I'm trying to be this good mother for, I'm going to be screaming at. So I never stopped to think that. So, take that pause. Take the time to figure out what are your real priorities. Recognize that time, we're not here that long. We have very short time horizons. Our lives are short. What do you want your time to have meant? What does it mean? And you'll find that your priorities, your to-do list, really shrinks to about maybe 3 or 4. There's not that many things that are all that important. And when you keep that time horizon and that focus on what's really important, you can have all that stuff on your to-do list, but you don't ever have to get to it because it's still going to be there. So when I talk about setting your priorities, it's maybe a few. Do meaningful work, and figure out what that is for you. Have time to connect, because that's what really the foundation of human happiness is, that, not schlepping kids around to a million different lessons and, making sure that they're overscheduled. But, maybe it's just like they're blowing bubbles and you sit and you watch them, or you have that moment of listen, my kids are now 13 and 15. They don't want to connect with me at all. So I'm struggling with trying to figure out how do you connect with people who don't like you anymore. But when they're little, they do. And so find those moments of genuine connection. If you work, what we're finding is that just like we sleep in 90-minute sleep cycles, we have 90-minute attentiveness cycles during the day. Work in 90-minute pulses and then take a break. Have that oscillation between deep, concentrated work and breaks. And then with a to-do list, the last thing I'll say is I initially started saying burn your to-do list, and people freaked out. No, I love my list. Don't make me burn it. And that's true. And lists are very, very useful. But I always felt like that I was living under the tyranny of the to-do list. If I wrote it down, I had to do it until I crossed it off. So then I'll say flip it. Flip your to-do list. Have those like handful of priorities, and then put what's most important. If it's like, make sure I sit down and like play trains today. Put it on your list, because that's actually more important than did they finish their homework. In 3rd grade, I'm sorry, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't. If you were going to die tomorrow, if your kid was going to die next week, what would you really do that's most important? It's not going to be like, make sure that the toys are all in the proper bins. It's just not. And so some of that is changing your own perspective of what's important, and that really can only come from you. So put joy first. And then the last thing is, do one thing a day, not 25. One of the things that I'll do is I'll do a brain dump, and I get everything out of my head, because then it clears space. I put it on what I call my master to-do list, and then I'll pick a few things that I'm going to do that week, and then every day I pick one thing. And that's one thing I'm going to do. And then the day you win, do that first. And some days that I can't stand the laundry, I'm going to fold the laundry. That's my one thing. Most days it's not. So pick one thing, and then the day feels like a win.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Brigid Schulte.